We're in the book of Ecclesiastes and have been for a couple of weeks and probably will be at least for the next few weeks in the book of Ecclesiastes. Out of that, after Ecclesiastes, we're going to go into the very simple book of Song of Solomon. Of course, I say that sarcastically. It's a book that's difficult, one we often ignore, but God preserved it for us for a reason, and so we'll talk about what we can learn from Song of Solomon after we finish the book of Ecclesiastes. But the book of Ecclesiastes, of course, was written by Solomon. And here's the richest man that has ever lived. He was the king over the nation of Israel. And that meant financially, what could Solomon do? Anything he wanted to do. In terms of power, what could Solomon do? Anything he wanted to do. There was no limits to what Solomon could do. And so Solomon tested life, and the conclusion that Solomon comes to is that when you take God out of the equation, life is vain. It does not have any lasting meaning, and there's really not any lasting purpose in life. In fact, the conclusion at the end is what makes man whole is fearing and serving God. Now, a couple of key terms for those that haven't been with us in this study. One is under the sun. That occurs, I think it is 37 times here in the book of Ecclesiastes, 34 times, excuse me. The word under the sun occurs. Vanity occurs 37 times. But what that tells me is that Solomon is primarily concerned with what makes for the best life where? Right here. He's not so much examining things from the standpoint of eternity, though he does mention that several times in Ecclesiastes, as Solomon is saying what makes for the best life right here. The other key term is the word vanity, and it's a word that means vapor, mist. It describes something that is fleeting. Do not take the word vapor to mean that there is no joy at all in the things of this world. What he's saying, for example, one way I always illustrate that, Ecclesiastes 11, childhood and the prime of life are vanity. What does that mean? It means one day you're young and the next day you're old. It passes very, very quickly. It doesn't last. So every time we see that word vapor, think of it from this standpoint. It doesn't last. It's only temporary. So as Solomon has begun to test things, he put it to the test in discourse number 1. And what Solomon said he had tried was what? Wine, wisdom, women, and wealth. And what did he find in exploring all those to find fulfillment in this life? It's all vain. The houses he built, the women he had the modern entertainment system. He could call people and entertain me at any point in time. And he said all of that is vanity. And the conclusion he came to at the end, this is important, is that man does not have the ability in himself to extract lasting happiness and joy from life. It has to be given to him how? By God. As a gift. Then in discourse number 2 that we finished last week, God has a plan that has a purpose. Now in that plan, there's a time to die, there's a time to be born. I guess a time to be born first, then a time to die. There's a time to sow, there's a time to tear. And man has to fit into that plan. I know God is in control and that God is in charge, but I will never fully what? Understand it all, and I have to learn to trust in the Lord. And so the conclusion that Solomon came to at the end of chapter 5, and that second discourse was this: enjoy life while you have it. It's a gift from God. So some have the idea, I think almost as you go through the Bible, that God does not expect Christians to enjoy life. And I think the exact opposite is true. What Solomon is saying in the book of Ecclesiastes is enjoy the good what? While you have it, it may not last, but enjoy, rejoice in what God has given to you. So now we're coming into chapter 6, and now Solomon begins to deal with some objections that may be made to God being in charge and to this whole premise about God making the difference. And if I had to sum, and you've heard me say this before, chapter 6 and 7 together, I would sum it up this way: things are not always what they appear to be from man's limited viewpoint. You can't judge a book by its cover. In other words, in chapter 6, I think what Solomon is pointing out is prosperity is not always or necessarily good. In other words, you might look at someone, and we'll describe him in a minute in Ecclesiastes chapter 6, that seemingly, from my viewpoint, they've got it all. They seemingly have everything you could possibly want in life, and yet what Solomon is saying, behind that wall, they may be what? They may be miserable. They may be unhappy. In fact, they may have little advantage or no advantage over the stillborn child, he's going to say in Ecclesiastes chapter 6. So what Solomon is, have you ever, by the way, observation tells you this, have you ever observed somebody, unfortunately I've seen it in the body of Christ, that you look at it and seemingly everybody thinks everything's just what? Fine. It's perfect. You know, they look like they have the perfect family. They come in and they sit and all the kids on the pew and they say the right things. And then later on you find out that behind that what? It wasn't what you thought it was. And that's what Solomon's, things aren't always what we think they are or what they seem to be. Prosperity is not always or necessarily good. On the other hand, adversity in chapter 7 is not always or necessarily a bad thing. Adversity may help to mold us. It may help to teach us some important things. So when you come to chapter 6 and 7 and we begin to deal with these questions, remember this, you can't judge a book by its cover. Things aren't always what they seem to be. So in chapter 6, we begin by saying one might be prosperous and then not enjoy that. There's an evil that I've seen under the sun, and it's common among men. Now, here's something that's very common. And here's this evil that I have seen under the sun. It's a man to whom God has given, and there are three things he's given him here in this particular, really four things if you go all the way down through verse 3. Number one, this man has riches and wealth. I mean, financially, he's what? He's well off. He's got everything he could possibly need. So the man described here has riches and he has wealth. What else does he have? He's got honor. He's well respected. He's got honor. He's well thought of. Not only does he have honor, what else does he mention about him? He lacks nothing for himself of all that he desires. In other words, he has everything that he wants. Not only that, I could add a fourth thing, and I don't have these on the chart. He has a large family. More about that in just a moment. But in verse 3, he might have 100 children. Now that's hyperbole there, but children were viewed as a sign of a divine blessing, and so to have 100 children saying what? He's very blessed. And so that's an hyperbole, not literally that he had 100 children. And so this is a man, again, what would we say about him? What does he have? He has it all. He has everything somebody could possibly want. You know, if you say, oh, what do you want when you grow up? You say, well, if I had money and people thought a lot of me and I could do anything I wanted and I had a good family, I seemingly would have everything that anybody in life could ever want. But what about this man? God gave him all of those gifts, but what did God not give him? The ability to enjoy it. God does not give him the power to eat of it. In fact, what might happen to it? Somebody might come, what? And take it away. It can be lost just like that. Some have argued that this was written at a later date, maybe during the days of the Persians. I don't believe that. And it's a time in which the Persians had come in and just taken everything away. I don't know that the writer has anything specific in mind in terms of an invader. His point is just simply what we have could be lost, what? Immediately. Not only that, you could have this man that begets 100 children and lives many years. Again, you know, we're talking about this man. He has 100 children, supposedly a sign of divine favor. He lives many years. I guess if we wanted to add something to that list, we've got money, we've got honor, we've got everything we want, we've got a good family, and now I'm going to live what? A good, long life, or at least a long life. I'm going to live many years. In fact, how is he described as living down in verse 6? He lives 1,000 years, what? Twice over. Again, what is that? That's hyperbole. It's an exaggeration. Nobody lives 1,000 years two times over. Not even Methuselah lived 1,000 years two times over. It's just a hyperbole. If it was possible for him to live that long, and yet his soul is not satisfied with goodness, he doesn't enjoy anything that he has. In fact, when he dies, what about him? Well, he goes to the same place everybody else. The same thing's going to happen to him, isn't it? He's going to die. And it describes him in verse 3, indeed, he has no burial. In other words, for all he's done, even when he dies, I think probably part of the implication is the children don't even come back what? To his funeral to remember him. I mean, he seemingly had everything, and yet in the end, he is forgotten, and a stillborn child is better than he. And he's talking about life here under the sun. Remember this. He's talking about in the here and the now because he's living for everything just in this life. And he's got God out of the picture. What advantage does he have over a stillborn child? The stillborn child comes in vanity and departs in darkness, and his name is covered with darkness. And in verse 5, though he has not seen the sun or known anything, this man has more rest, or the stillborn child has more rest than that man. Why? Well, because he hasn't had to share in all the disappointments and the inequities of this life. And so this man who's prosperous, who seemingly has everything, and ultimately he goes to the same place that everybody else goes, and he hasn't enjoyed anything that he has. I mean, stories are just legion of individuals that did very well. Was it the millionaire? Was it Howard Hughes? You remember that died what, as a recluse? And I've read stories about his appearance and everything. Supposedly, if you looked at it from the outside, you'd have thought, what? He's been blessed, but it's obvious he was absolutely what? Miserable. And so it is possible what Solomon is saying. You're saying, well, why is he prosperous? Well, he might be prosperous, but he may not what? He may not be happy, and he may not be enjoying it. The second thing he says here, and closely connected with that, is riches do not satisfy. All the labor a man is for his mouth, and yet the soul is not satisfied. For what more has the wise man than a fool? And what does the poor man have who knows how to walk before the living? Here's the point. When a man's living for wealth, and I think that's what he's describing here, all he's laboring for is for his mouth. And that doesn't mean that everything that he's spending goes directly into his belly. It is that what's he working for? It's all about satisfying what? His self, his appetites, his hunger. Much like in the New Testament, remember when the Bible says the God is his belly? He's just saying he's living to satisfy what he wants. That's what life is about. So everything he's working for is to satisfy his mouth, and yet he's not what? He's not satisfied. Now, he's not saying here, and I think this is important, Solomon's not saying that there's never anybody in life that's content with what they have. That's not what Solomon is saying. In fact, the Bible commands us to what? Be content. And I've known some people that were very satisfied with what they had. There was a guy in the first congregation, they lived in if you ever seen look like the old shotgun houses in the South. I mean, there was you walked in and there was the living room and the kitchen together. It's probably smaller than most of our living rooms by themselves. And then they had a bedroom in the back and one bathroom in the back. In fact, when they died, they tore it down. The family just said it's not even worth selling. The property's worth more than the house. And yet they were very content, very happy. I mean, he had a car that was 50 years old that still ran. He had a truck, that was several years old that still ran. He had a new pair of overalls he could put on Wednesday night to go to church. And if his daughter ever said anything to him like, Dad, our daughter-in-law, let's go buy you some new shoes, he'd say, you know what? These still have some soul left on them. Somebody might need that sometime. He was just happy with where he was. He was content. So I say all that to say, Solomon is not saying that people are never satisfied with what they have. But I think what Solomon is saying is when we're living for material things, when we are pursuing material things, we're never going to what? We're never going to have enough. That you get that first million, then what are you going to want? You're going to want the second million. And then you get the second million, you think, well, you know what? I want 4 million. And you're just never, when that's what the goal in life is, you're never satisfied. And in that regard, the rich and the wise has no advantage over the fool in that regard. And I think that's the point when he said, what more has the fool man than the wise? What does the poor man have who knows how to walk before the living? That is, there's no advantage. The poor man, somebody might say, well, if riches aren't going to satisfy, I'll just be poor. Well, the poor is just as unsatisfied what? Without God as the rich man is. There's no advantage to one over the other as you take God out of the equation. In fact, what God expects of us, what's the better option in verse 9, is better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. What's Solomon saying in verse 9? We have a proverb. You ever heard the proverb that we use? Better is a bird, what? In the hand than two, what? In the bush. What does that mean? Better be satisfied, what? With what you have instead of dreaming what you don't have. Okay. And I think what Solomon is saying in verse 9 here very simply is the person that is just satisfied with what he's got as opposed to wondering desire, looking around at what everybody else has and saying what? Oh man, I sure wished I had what? I wished I had that. I wish I could afford that. Better is the person that just is satisfied with what? What God's given to them. He said this also is vanity and grasping for the wind. So, riches are not going to satisfy. Better be satisfied with what you have than to strive for things that you don't have and be discontent with what you don't have. Then in 10 to 12, I think the point is that ultimately God is in control. And God in His providence, His rule, whatever one is been named already, for it is known that he is man, and he cannot contend with one who is mightier than he. I don't think Solomon is saying here, because this would not fit with what the rest of the Bible says, that everything about man is just sort of pre-programmed and we don't have any choice at all in the matter. But he is saying that there's really nothing new under the sun. And God in His providence, when God in His providence has decided on a particular course, then man in his wisdom can't argue what? With the Lord. Who can contend with the Almighty? What's the implied answer? Nobody. I mean, suppose, for example, this is sort of a temporal, a weak example, but suppose you decided today you just don't want it to rain. You have the power to change that? No. You can't change that. There are things that are simply beyond what? Our ability to control. If we could, we would. And I think that's all Solomon is saying. There are some things that are beyond our control, and if God has decided on a particular course, in His providence, maybe for example, trials or tribulation, who are we that we can contend with God and say, God, you've got that wrong? No, that's not the way it's going to be. It's going to go what? It's going to go this other way. In fact, what happens in verse 12, and I think this is a reminder of Solomon, who knows what is good for man in life? It's been looked at a couple of different ways. Some have looked at it from this perspective. How do I know what is good for me in terms of living my life, in terms of what life is for apart from God? What's life about? What's my purpose in life? And that could be. But I think probably a little bit more specific, Solomon is saying we don't always, in our wisdom, even know what's best for us. See, if I'm choosing what's best for me, then I might think, you know what, $1 million wouldn't do too bad for me, right? I don't want it, by the way, but I'm just saying, if that's the way we we might think, well, this is best for me. Let me illustrate that. Think about Paul in all of his wisdom and the thorn in the flesh. Paul thought the best thing for me is what? Get rid of the thorn in the flesh. God said, no, Paul, the best thing for you what? Is to keep it. That just simply illustrates the point that I don't even know what always is best for me. Maybe what's best for me may be what? Some adversity. Is adversity ever good for me? Sure it is. And we're going to see that in the next chapter. I don't always know what's good for me. Not only do I not always know what's good for me, I don't always know what the future holds. Who can tell man what will happen after him on the sun? So because of my limited viewpoint, I don't always know what's best, and I don't even know what the future holds. If I did, could that help me in making evaluations? Sure it would. Have you ever said, because I've said before, I just wished I knew what was going to what? What was going to happen. If I just knew, then I'd know what to do what? Right now. The reality is, though, I don't know. So what's the point of that? The point seems to be you can contend with one mightier. Man really does not know what's best for him, so learn to accept and trust what? God and his providence. Okay. So don't look at the man that's prosperous out here and say, I'm envious of him. Some, by the way, and I think this could well be, some believe that verse 10 to 12 really fits better with chapter 7 than it does with chapter 6. And one of the reasons that they argue that is that when you look down at, or even through chapter 8, when you look at the conclusion, that what you've got is bookends here. And that what Solomon in essence is doing is he's introducing this idea that we don't always know what's good for us. God does. And we don't know what the future holds, but God does. Therefore, it might be in chapter 7 that suffering may be what we need. Does anybody look real quick at chapter 7? Just look through there very quickly. Tell me what's one of the key words in chapter 7. It is the word what? Better. Look, highlight it. Good name is better. It's better to go to the house in the morning. Sorrow's better than laughter. It's better to hear the rebuke of food. So there's a series of contrasts here. If you can, go through there and highlight that word better. And one of the things that almost always strikes me when I read through chapter 7, and I've used this chapter, I don't know, it's beyond my ability to count how many times I've used this chapter at a funeral, where it talks about it's better to go to the house of mourning than the house of feasting, for this is the end of all men, the living will take it to heart. And one of the things that always strikes me about this is what Solomon is saying is completely and totally contrary to what I'd think and you would think. I mean, nobody enjoys a funeral. I mean, how many of you ever get up in the morning and get the paper out or look online, the obituary, and say, oh, honey, good news. We get to go to a funeral this week. It's wonderful. We don't enjoy funerals, but they're good for us. That's the point. None of us enjoy sorrow. None of us say, you know what, I think this is just going to be a terrible week. I just can't wait. How many of us enjoy sorrow over what? Laughter. But sometimes what's good for us is what? Is sorrow. So what Solomon does is he begins and he draws suffering in comparison to mirth. First of all, a good name is better than precious ointment. What's a good name? Good reputation. Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 1, I think, is the only other passage in the Bible that uses the word good name expressly, at least in the New King James. But a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and loving favor rather than silver or gold. In other words, having a good reputation, that's more important than what? Than being rich. In other words, suppose you've got a man over here that he's got all the wealth in the world, but his reputation is what? He's crooked. He's underhanded. He doesn't have a great reputation. Which would you rather have? I'd rather have a good what? Good name. The day of death is better than the day of one's birth. Now, a couple of things about that particular statement. Number one, some believe, and it may be that that's directly connected with the good name. And from this standpoint, that when I am dead and I am gone, my name is what? Well, it's all that's left. But my reputation is what? Solidified. It's solidified. I can't mess it up anymore. As long as I'm on this side of eternity, as long as I'm living, I can mess up, right? Ecclesiastes 10 and verse 1 tells me, how much it takes to ruin a reputation? One act of folly. So that, you can live a lifetime of service to God and doing good, and you mess up what? One time, and your reputation can just be absolutely ruined. And some believe that he's saying here that, I tell you what, the day of death is better than the day of birth, because when you enter this world, now you've got a lifetime of trying to maintain a reputation and a name and trying to do the right thing. But at death, it's solidified and your reputation is set. That could be. I prefer to look at it in a little bit broader sense. We're all excited about births. Somebody come in and say, my grandbaby was born or great-grandbaby was born, and we want to share it. Now, have you seen the pictures? We're all excited about that. But in what sense, then, is death better than birth? Well, death, let's look at this. What does death end? I'm talking about if somebody has served. What does it end? It ends the troubles of this life. You know what? When one dies, in the Lord, it's the end of suffering. No more pain. It's the end of sorrows. It's the end of dealing with temptation and the battle with the devil trying to get us to go astray. In fact, the Apostle Paul said to depart and to be with Christ is far better. You know, blessed is the dead that die in the Lord from now on, for they shall rest from their labors and the works do follow them.
Also, the day of one birth, that person has no influence, has no good that is done.
Yeah.
Been born, but on the day of death, all the good that person left behind attributes to his good name.
Right, attributes to his good name. That's true. He's got a reputation. When, you know, I don't always think about it from this standpoint, nor do I think we need to always think about it from this standpoint. But you know, when a baby's born, and we're sitting there, and it has crossed my mind before as I'm sitting there holding a grandbaby or something to realize, you know what, as joyous as this is, this baby just came into a world what? Full of sin and sorrow. And as sweet and innocent as she is right now, you know, if the world stands and she becomes a teenager, the devil's going to be with her, after her with what? With all he's got. And so the point is, in one standpoint, the day of death is better than the day of one's birth. Sorrow is not always a bad thing. What seems to man's perspective to be something bad isn't always what? Isn't always that bad. Not only that, it's better to go to the house of mourning than the house of feasting, for this is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. It's good to go to a funeral sometimes. I've said this before. Take it for what it's worth. I see parents that sometimes, I've known some parents that their kids got up to be teenagers and they've never been to a funeral a day in their life. You know, and or they'll go to the funeral home and they'll say, we're going to stay back here. We don't want them to go up there and see. Well, I want to tell you what children need to learn eventually is what? Death's part of life. That's part of the times I felt like my kids were growing up at funeral homes. I mean, there's just times where it just seemed like one right after another. We were at a funeral home. One funeral right after the other. And I tell you what that doesn't do. It doesn't warp a child. It doesn't ruin them, but it does teach them something. What does it teach them? Death's coming to all of us. And I know that. Listen, I know that. You know that. If you'd asked me at 10 years old, does everybody die? Yes, everybody dies. But there's just something about going to a funeral and seeing somebody you know. There's something about going to a funeral and seeing a loved one. You know, maybe it's a granddad, maybe it's a dad, maybe it's an uncle or somebody that you thought, you know what, it seemed to me, I remember they were just the pinnacle of strength and it seemed like they were always going to be here, and now what? They're gone. And that gives me a time to reflect, you know what? That's going to be me one day. People are going to be coming together to remember me. And so that has an advantage. Our party's okay. Sure. But you know, we get together, if we got together and we played cards and we tell jokes and we laugh, how often do you leave that saying, you know what, that was just a time of sober reflection? No. Are they valuable? Yeah, they're valuable. I'm not minimizing the importance of that, but they don't have quite the soberness and the impact on us that a funeral has. Sometimes a funeral's a good thing. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. Why is sorrow better than laughter? The teaching aspect. Well, let me just say, first of all, I think from one standpoint, you know what, I don't really appreciate the laughter till I've seen the sorrow. You know? I don't know that you really truly appreciate what? The mountaintop until you've been where? In the valley. So I do think from one standpoint, sorrow just helps us to appreciate the laughter. But sorrow has a way of driving us to the Lord and causing dependence upon Him. I almost guarantee you, if I was to go through this audience and ask, I'm not going to, when in your life have you prayed the most to God? When are those moments where you found yourself thinking about spiritual things more, you found yourself praying more, you found yourself turning to God's Word more? You know what probably almost everyone would have in common? When is it? It's time of adversity. It's times of sorrow. That's what Paul said in 2 Corinthians 12, because when I'm weak, then I'm strong. When things in my life are just going what? Every way, exactly like I want it to go, I've become a little bit more self-sufficient than I need to be. I tend to think about God less than I should But in times of sorrow, there's a time of sober reflection of my need to God when I don't know where else to turn. What? That's where I end up going. The heart of the wise is in the house in the morning, but the house of fools is in the house. The heart of fools in the house of mirth. It's better to hear the rebuke of the wise than the song of fools. What's the song of fools? Do what? Well, the song of fools is the one that comes up and always says, "Oh, you're doing just what? Great. Keep it up. Everything, man, I just think the world of you. Doesn't matter what I'm doing, what are they going to do? They're going to sing my praises." That's what is described here. Here's a person that they're, no matter what's going on, no matter how I'm acting, they're there to pat me on the back and praise me and say, "Way to go. That's wonderful." Well, I like to hear that. Don't you? I think that's what Solomon is saying. What did we rather hear? I like to hear somebody say what? "Good job, way to go." But sometimes what I need, what? Is the rebuke of fools that says what? That's not right. You need to straighten up. You're not living in the right way. In fact, Psalm 141 is a passage I mark out here in the margin of my Bible next to that. Psalm 141, and in verse 5, the psalmist David said and prayed. You ever prayed this, by the way? "Let the righteous strike me. It will be a kindness. Let him reprove me. It shall be as excellent oil. Let my head not refuse it." In other words, what David was praying is, if I need to be rebuked, then let somebody what? Rebuke me, and let me consider it to be what? A blessing, a kindness. You ever thought, where would David be without a Nathan? If Nathan, I am sure there were plenty of people in David's kingdom at that day that were walking up to David and patting him on the back and saying what? "You're doing a great job. Keep it up. We're behind you 100%. You know what David needed? He needed Nathan to say what? "You messed up. You need to straighten up. And you need to repent." And David appreciated that. And so nobody enjoys it. Listen, is there anybody here that enjoys a good rebuke? "Oh man, I wish somebody would come and just rebuke me now." There's not much of a way, as we've always said, to skin a cat and a cat like it. And there's not much of a way to rebuke somebody, and at the time we say what? "Oh, that was great to hear." But on sober reflection, it may make a difference in our lives. And so, in fact, what he does is he compares in verse 6 the song of fools like the crackling of thorns under a pot. Might illustrate this way, like back in the day when Brother Ross would have built a fire and heated with wood, he probably didn't go out and grab a bunch of thorns and throw them in the fire. Why? You know what thorns and all that will do? They make a lot of noise, but they provide little heat. And that's the point. It's like those thorns at the crackling under the pot. It's a lot of noise and little value is what it is. "Surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and a bribe debases the heart." The end of a thing is better than the beginning. Sometimes we get excited about starting something, but it's better to end something than to begin it. Why so? You've accomplished something. By the way, it's not very hard to start something. This world is full of things that people started and never finished. How many of you have ever started at the beginning of the year a daily Bible reading program? And you start it, and then we get into, and somewhere along the line, what? We stop. Well, I commend somebody for starting, but you know what's better? When you get to the end, you say, what? I did it. I've accomplished that. We might get excited about breaking ground on a new house, but I tell you what's even better than that is what? When the last nail is hung and the loan is closed and everything is. Tell you what's even better than that is when it's what? Finally paid off and it's yours. The end is better than the beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. The point seems to be the big talker, the one that seemingly has everything, The one that has an advantage over him is the one that is patient. What's that? The one that just keeps on what? Keeping on. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. All of this, by the way, may be connected back to this idea of us not always knowing what's best for us. And two things. People can respond in one of two ways in times of adversity. I've known people that in times of adversity, in times of loss, and I'm talking about serious adversity. I'm not talking about, something light, that they turn and they get mad at who? God. They blame God. You know somebody blames God for their difficulties and their problems, and they're quick to anger. And it may be that in verse 9, as he's going through all of these things, saying, because you don't always know what you need, don't be quick to get mad when things aren't going exactly the way that you think they should, and point the finger of blame at God. It may well be that God's got your best interest at heart, and you don't even know it. So don't be quick to be angry, for it is foolishness. And I tell you something that's bad that we all do sometimes, is we're all bad to say, I wish I'd go back. Because, the former days, what? Oh, they're so much better than today. The former day. In other words, we live with a view toward the past. What does Solomon say about that? Yeah, probably forgot our trouble. You don't inquire wisely concerning this. I think we do that. I think we do that personally. Sometimes we look back and we think, I sure wish I'd go back when my kids were little. Things were so much easier back then. I wish I could go back with it. And we look back and we just forget about the struggles of that. But I tell you what, also, it's not just that we're forgetting about the struggles of the past. We're not really considering how blessed we are, today. I think we do that sometimes as God's people. We'll talk about, things used to be so much better in our country than they are now. And I think, well, when the former days were better, I wonder what days those were. Where's the days when we owned slaves in our country and people were abused? Was it the days where, in the free love movement, you know what I'm saying, of the 50s and the 60s, and men coming back from serving in our country in Vietnam being spat on and mistreated? My point is simply this. When we look back, what do we think? We only see the good side oftentimes, don't we? And we don't really realize, the past had its troubles too. It had its troubles too. But if we're always looking in the rearview mirror as to how life has been, then we don't enjoy the present. I've always tried, I'm not saying I always do this perfectly, I've always tried to be content with where I'm at. I enjoyed every moment of raising my 4 kids, but you know what? That time's gone. I can't go back and I can't do it again. I enjoy where I'm at right now. And if the Lord was to come back and say you could go back in time, you know what I wouldn't want to do? I wouldn't want to go back in time. I want to enjoy what God has given to me at the present time and where I am. And I think that's what Solomon's point was. Instead of looking back, why not look at what you have and then look forward and continue to press on? The value of suffering sometimes causes us to get mad at God, and sometimes it causes even to look back and to long for another day. And sometimes when you're doing that, you're not really learning what you need to learn. Look, in verse 11, wisdom is good with an inheritance and profitable to those under the sun. For wisdom is a defense as money is a defense, but the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who use it. Is it good to have wisdom? Yeah, it's good to have wisdom. And one reason it's good to have wisdom is it helps us, it's a defense. And so look at things from the wise perspective. And also in the midst of suffering, submit to God's providence. Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? What's the answer to that? Nobody. Nobody can, right? If God's made it straight, you're not going to make it crooked. God made it crooked, you're not going to make it straight. So, what do? I don't have the full picture, right? Do you have the full picture of everything? I don't always know what God's doing, how he's working it out, but I do know this. Prosperity is not always good. Adversity is not always bad. I know God knows what he's doing, right? So, what do? So, here's what I do. When things are going well in life, in times of prosperity, what do? I'm going to be joyful. I'm going to enjoy those good times. When I have my health and I have whatever wealth I have and things are going well, you know what I'm going to do? This is what Solomon's advice is, what? Enjoy life. God doesn't expect you to walk around like you're going to trip over your lower lip. God says when things are good, what? Enjoy. Have you ever known somebody can enjoy what they have for fear it's going to change? And I think what Solomon is saying, when things are going well, you ever heard the statement by Mark Twain? I know you have. That I've worried about a great many things in my life, the greater part of which never happened. And I've known some Christians like that. That you talk to them and things are going well. And they can't enjoy what's going well because they're worried about what? What's going to happen. You know, it could be. It might be. And I think what Solomon is saying, when things are going well, what? Enjoy that time. Rejoice it. Give thanks to God for all that you've got, okay? Now, what about the opposite side of the coin? What about times of adversity? What about when things aren't what I want them to be? What do? I think. I consider. What am I thinking? What can I learn? What does God want me to learn from this? Surely God has appointed one as well as the other, so that man cannot tell what will happen after him. In other words, I use that as a time to consider, is there something I can learn in this circumstance? Is there something I can use to draw what? To draw closer to God? Is there something that I can learn to help me help others in their struggle? In other words, the point is when the times of adversity come around, don't just put the finger of blame at God or throw up your hands, but use it as a time to think God gave you that time just like He gave you what? The times of adversity. The times of joy. So here's the point. No matter what happens in your life, consider the work of God. Think about it so that man can find nothing that will happen after him. This is what I take that to mean. If you ask me right now, my life's good. I enjoy where I'm at. You know what I don't know? I don't know what next year brings. I don't know what tomorrow brings. I don't even know what the rest of this day brings, for that matter. And so because I don't know what's going to happen, in the sense of learning from the circumstance, I need to learn to live in that moment. Do you understand what I'm saying? I'm not living in that moment from the standpoint that I don't have it in mind. But since I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, sufficient for the day is what? The trouble thereof. I'll worry about that when? Tomorrow. But right now, if it's times of joy, I'm going to enjoy it. If it's times of adversity, I'm going to consider it. And it may be tomorrow's completely different, and I'll worry about that when? I'll worry about that tomorrow. So, adversity is not always bad. Prosperity is not always good. Now, I'll tell you something else very quickly that I think in 15 to 22 very quickly helps me to get a good grip on things is that there's an accurate assessment of man's character explains some of the inequalities. You ever heard somebody say, maybe you've said it, what did I do to deserve this? You know, why am I going what? Through this? Well, I think what Solomon is saying in this section, very quickly, I'm going to hit the highlights here, and then we'll talk about any application if already questions, is that sometimes in life, things aren't always fair. You know, sometimes there's a just man who perishes in his righteousness, and there's a wicked man who prolongs his life in his wickedness, okay? Sometimes it happens to the righteous according to the wicked according to the righteous. Do you in life know anybody that's righteous that died young? Sure I do. Sure I do. You never known anybody righteous that just seemed like they had a hard life? Sure I have. Sometimes it happens to the righteous according to the wicked. Have you ever known somebody wicked that they lived a good, seemingly a good long life and sure. So sometimes life is not fair. So what do? Well, verse 16, do not be overly righteous nor be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Do not be overly wicked nor be foolish. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you grasp this and also not remove your hand from the other, for he who fears God will escape them all. What does it mean not be overly righteous? Huh? Well, it may mean, there are a couple of different explanations. Bob Waldron says in his commentary that too much passes for piety is not piety at all. And so the idea there is don't make rules God has made. That could be. I'm wondering if the point is that when that happens, don't become so righteous that you think you can tell God how things ought to be done. In other words, we begin to question, we become so what? Why we can tell the Lord what to do. That's one reaction to difficult times. But don't be overly wicked either. Why should you die before your time? Instead, what you need to do is you need to fear God. Also, another thing that we have to realize, and I'm going to finish this real quick, is nobody's perfectly sinless in verse 20 and 22. There is not a just man on earth who does good and not sin. And also do not take to heart everything people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. But I think the point of verse 20 is, see, in life, this is the way it is. When bad things happen to me, you know what I say? I'm talking about men in general. We say what? What did I do to deserve this? Why am I being treated this way? When in reality, if I take a good close look at myself, you know what I realize? I'm not what? I'm not perfect. Have you ever transgressed God's law? Yeah. You a sinner? Yeah. So why are we out? I think Solomon's point, why are we then saying, you know what? I don't deserve to be treated this way. How often do you do that when you get a raise? How often do you do that when things are going well in life? Do you step back and say, what have I done that God has been what? So good to me. And I think what Solomon is saying is when you begin to get an accurate assessment and realize that everything that appears to be righteous isn't really righteousness. And that may be part of the point of verses 15 to 18. There are people that appear to be righteous, but it's not real righteousness, okay? It's just what? It's a facade that's put up. And God can see behind that. Nobody is sinlessly perfect. You failed. You've transgressed God's law. And then in 23 to 29, very quickly, the difficulty of obtaining true wisdom. Solomon in this particular section said, I've been unable to fully obtain it. Solomon, we always say, if we were playing Bible trivia and the question comes up, who's the wisest man that ever lived? Everybody's going to say what? Solomon. And what Solomon has said, all this I have proved by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. As for that which is far off and exceedingly deep, who can find it out? I applied my heart to know, to search, and to seek out wisdom and the reason of things, to know the wickedness and folly, even of foolishness and madness. And I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be taken from her. Very, very quickly, I'm going to mention this. I may talk about this a little bit more next week, but Solomon said, wisdom is so hard to find that only one man among 1,000 has it, and you can't find a woman that's wise at all. I take Solomon probably talking about his women. In other words, not a general statement about women, they don't have wisdom, but remember his wives and concubines, that among those he surrounded himself with, none of them seemed to have much wisdom at all. We'll cover that very quickly. I took a little bit more time on that than I want to, and we'll go to chapters 8 through 10 probably